Good evening. I'm Nina Rowe. I'm a professor of art history here at Fordham, and it's a pleasure and an honor to introduce our guest, Katrin Kogman-Appel, to the folks who are gathered here and to the many people out in the Zoomosphere. So the Center for Jewish Studies here at Fordham is hosting Katrin as a distinguished lecturer for a 2-week residency. And during this time, Katrin is sharing with us 3 lectures and 2 workshops. We just finished up on the first of those workshops here on the 4th floor of Walsh Library at Fordham's Rose Hill campus. And last night, we had the first in a trio of lectures that Katrin is giving during her stay in New York. So the details of all the events are on the screen, and you'll notice a QR code that you can use to sign up, or you can email me or the Center for Jewish Studies if that's simpler for you. So now I'm just zooming in just to highlight the theme of Katrin's lecture series, the overall title of which is The Medieval Passover Haggadah, From Rituals to Illuminations. And you can see that there's this sequence of 3 lectures structured around the theme, the book and the Seder. As I mentioned, last night was the first in that series. And so in that talk last night, Katrin shared with us her research on the way that instruction for orchestrating the Passover Seder was handled before the development of the self-contained autonomous Haggadah, giving instructions for leading and participating in the ritual meal of Passover. I'm sure she will review it too, but I'm still thinking about all the things that she shared with us about some of these devices that people had, about there would be an expert who would go from house to house instructing people, or at least instructing them, or that they could hold like a crash course at the synagogue in the lead up to Passover, prepping householders on what to do once they were home celebrating. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who is excited about what is in store for us tonight. But before I hand that over, I want to just give you a little background about Katrin for those who were not part of our proceedings last night. Katrin Kogman-Appel is really at the peak of a career that spans several decades of award-winning and widely celebrated research as a leading scholar of medieval Hebrew illuminated manuscripts and their place in the ritual and social lives of medieval Jews. She holds the Alexander von Humboldt Professorship in Jewish Studies at the University of Münster in Germany. And until 2015, she was professor, vice dean, and holder of the Evelyn Metz Memorial Research Chair at Ben Gurion University in Israel. She has also held positions in the States as a researcher and lecturer at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1990s and as a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton in 1993 and again in 2010. The clock is ticking, and I think we're probably all eager to hear what Katrin has to share with us. So on with the main event, Katrin will deliver her talk, The Book and the Seder 2, The Birth of the Standalone Haggadah and Its Early History. Please join me in a round of applause welcoming Katrin Kogman-Appel.
Actually, the book and the Seder, The Birth of the Standalone Haggadah, and it's early history up to the 17th century in a way. This is actually better, probably. Yeah, I mean, as long as the screen is not. And okay, I'm going to move this way, right?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So, in the first part of this series, I noted that the evidence of premodern Haggadot is strikingly. Check this. Oh, this is this is yours and this is mine, I guess. Yeah. Okay. So. Oh, can I? Yeah. Okay. Oh, as a remote. Okay. Good. Thank you. So I noted yesterday that the evidence of premodern Haggadot is strikingly meager in comparison to other kinds of books And my goal today is to tell the story of the standalone Haggadah as a book genre in its own right. I also noted that this was a centuries-long, rather complex process of emergence until the Haggadah finally began to turn into a common household item in the middle of the 17th century, somewhat in the way we know it today. So the Jewish liturgy was committed to writing around the 9th century. And I mentioned yesterday Amram Gaon and Saadia Gaon. By then, the Haggadah was an integral part of the Siddur. Standalone Haggadot began to appear on their own in the 12th, 13th. There are very few items in the Geniza from the 11th, and I'm going to talk a bit about these Geniza items today because they're very unknown, actually, and quite interesting. They became more frequent, but not overwhelmingly popular during the 15th century. We recall that what is crucial in looking at the Haggadah as an object, a ritual device, is the distinction between the notion of abstract text and the notion of material object, a physical book. Let us then look together at the surviving material evidence beyond those facsimiles that I was able to show you earlier today, because there's much more. Yes. So, in his famous anthology, Haggadah and History, Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi wrote in 1975, having now followed the Haggadah through the early decades of Hebrew printing, and this book is only about printed Haggadot, one must be struck by the extreme paucity of editions in this period. In all its various formats, we find about 6 Haggadahs, of which only 2 or 3 are separate productions. Even if we grant the possibility that someday a few others may turn up, the meager total seems quite puzzling. Early Hebrew books were usually published in no more than a few hundred copies. Surely the editions we have surveyed did not meet the needs of the contemporary Jewish world or even of the countries in which they were printed. So he left the question open. He said, well, we have some, we know more or less the demographics, and the evidence we have of printed Haggadot is definitely not enough for all these populations. So, but he did not have actually an answer to this question. In the last session yesterday, I also discussed the role of the transition from oral societies to societies that relied on written text, that reached a peak in the late Middle Ages, and which resulted in a steady increase in the demand for books, which was eventually met by print technology. It is likely then that the Haggadah emerged around that time, and in reaction to these developments, that is about the 13th century, when this process from orality to textuality to written objects was at its peaks. So what is my plan for today? Oops, this starts out here. I shall discuss some statistic evidence towards an attempt to map the production of prayer books in Jewish societies and the emergence of the Haggadah as a standalone book. In parallel, I shall look at the material features, and this is going to be a bit more interesting than the statistics, I hope. So that's why I'm doing this in parallel, W. I shall look at the material features of these books and show how they afforded different kinds of use. While doing so, I shall also briefly discuss illustration and yet another material feature. These will be discussed in more detail in the third session, when I shall speak about how these books were actually used and by whom. In the last part of today's meeting, I shall share with you some evidence from book lists in an attempt to find out what actually went on within the Jewish households, and that will lead us to the end of the 16th century. So my attempt to map the appearance of standalone Haggadot is based on a corpus of 2,003 items of liturgical text, both handwritten and printed, covering a period from the mid-12th to the mid-17th century. But that was my corpus, 2003 items. There are three different types. One are fragments from the Cairo Geniza. The second was liturgical manuscripts outside the Geniza. And the third is printed material. Although this endeavor is designed as a quantitative approach, the resulting observations become meaningful only against the background of qualitative information to follow in the second part of this meeting and in the next lecture. I examined the number of Haggadot in relation to the number of other liturgical books in any given area and time span. So let's start with the Geniza. The Cairo Geniza preserved over 1,000 fragments that contain portions of the Haggadah. However, in most cases, there is no way to know whether these fragments were originally part of individual standalone Haggadot or larger units. There's just, in most of the cases, is this moving? Okay, I wasn't thinking of moving actually, so I don't know why this is. Okay. Here we go. This is the one I wanted. Okay, so in most cases we cannot tell if this is. Maybe I just touched of. Yeah, that's a good idea. Thank you. We cannot tell if this was actually any. You see how fragmentary they are. Sometimes you just have a few words, the end of lines, and you cannot say if this was from a Seder or from a standalone Haggadah. It is only in a very few cases that some textual considerations or material features, such as blank pages, as you see in the left example here, that actually tell you that, yeah, this may have been a standalone Haggadah because it has a blank page either at its end or at its beginning. A quantitative assessment is not possible in this case, but we do learn from examining these fragments that in what is commonly labeled the Geniza Society, relatively small booklets of the Haggadah must have existed. We don't know how many and how many people actually owned such or made such books. Before I shall look at the material evidence, however, a few methodological remarks about how material evidence was and is approached in the scholarship on book history are in place. First, there was the bibliographical method. In Jewish studies, associated most outstandingly with Moritz Steinschneider and later Abraham Haberman and numerous others. Theirs was a descriptive approach aimed at offering a first assessment of books, both manuscripts and early prints. And there is parallel scholarship also for Christian and Muslim manuscripts. Then came the Annales School, several members of which had a distinct interest in book history. First and foremost, Lucien Febvre, guided by their interests in social contexts. These people pushed towards quantitative methods because they were interested in who read what and in statistical information. This was an approach that was enthusiastically embraced in Jewish studies by Tzipora Baruchson in the 1990s. A late member of the this is Tzipora Baruchson, and a more recent member of the Annales School is Roger Chartier, who was the first to push reception into the focus of interest, how certain books were received by certain readers and users. In his views, material features are one of the keys to come to grips with reception. Now, the bibliographical school actually was interested in material elements, let's put it that way. But they started to have codicological interest and so on. But this was more just simply for the sake of attribution, most commonly. And then the Annales School kind of pushed away and was mainly interested in the social context and in more sociological questions. So Roger Chartier was actually bringing back the material interest into the discourse of book history. The most recent step in these attempts to approach reception is praxeology, the study of how books were actually handled. In order to know how books were handled, we need to come to grips with the materiality, how the size, the layout, the format, and the weight of a book afforded certain uses. Now, affordance is an anthropological term towards dealing with the question, what kind of uses the shape and the material nature of a certain object affords. A huge and heavy Ashkenazi machzor, like this one, the very famous Amsterdam machzor, the upper one, it's 50 centimeters high and that thick. So this is the statement. So a huge and heavy Ashkenazi machzor affords communal use, not homely, intimate, private use. It affords public display. It affords to be put on a lectern and to be used by a Seder leader who fulfills the liturgical obligation of many. Mutzi rabim lidei chova. It does not afford private use at the dinner table during the Seder ritual, even though it contains the Haggadah very strangely. Nobody knows why, because this was definitely not useful to be used at a Seder. I've seen this manuscript. You barely can lift it, actually. So, and neither does a Siddur. Albeit, and here you have it just from the back, so to see how bulky and thick this can be. A Siddur, albeit smaller than an Ashkenazi machzor, is still bulky, thick, heavy, and usually has a small script layout. In contrast, the Haggadah is small, lightweight book, which often, albeit not always, can be handled with one hand. It most often had a large script layout that affords reading during evening hours at dim artificial light, and I have mentioned that already several times. And artificial light was dim in the Middle Ages. There was no really much light. And these are thin books, and those among who have been to the facsimile workshop got an idea about how actually small they can be. I mean, thin especially. With these remarks in mind, let us briefly look at some Geniza fragments now before we move on to the manuscript evidence. Geniza fragments are the most difficult items to deal with, as their material features have first to be reconstructed in order to understand what kind of book these actually were. Due to the time frame given here, I shall limit myself to showing you just one example. Among the earliest Haggadah fragments is a relatively small, torn parchment sheet. That's all we have. 14.5 centimeters high, so this is tiny. And it's from the 11th or the 12th century approximately, but by paleography. One side contains a professionally penned text in square letters. So this is professional writing. So this is just the two sides of the same fragment. So this is a professionally penned text in square letters. It displays 12 lines on a page, 13 on the other. The second folio shows what is apparently a title page here. And here you can read Al-Pesach, which is kind of an Arabization of Pesach. So this is something for Pesach. We know from the title, and there is a title. Most of these fragments don't have titles. It is followed by instructions in Arabic and the beginning of the Kiddush. And I should again emphasize these Arabic instructions are in Hebrew letters. I forgot to mention that yesterday, but and Cynthia actually alerted me to that. So whatever is their Arabic, it's in Hebrew letters. So it is followed by instructions in Arabic and the beginning of the Kiddush. Its verso page was blank, this one, except for the mention of a name, one Menashe. But apart from that, it was blank. And the blank space was later used for jottings, probably just some exercise, writing exercise by a child. And very often, once these books were not any longer fit for use, they were used for reading exercises or writing exercises. And that already Goiten talked about it in his huge Mediterranean Society. So the actual Haggadah page shows the beginning of the Hallel before the meal, lefichach, and so on. And that is the right-hand slide. I think I got mixed up with right and left. But anyway, it's the Hallel. So this is in the middle of the Haggadah, actually. Hence, this choir ends just before the meal and would have contained altogether about 1,240 words. About half or slightly less of what we would expect in a Haggadah. So this is the way you can actually reconstruct such a book. Count the words that you have, think of how a choir could be built, how many pages such a choir had, and how many more words you need to have the whole Haggadah actually before you. So if this was a full Haggadah, it must have covered another choir of about 6 sheets. In short, this could have been a small, handy booklet, 14 centimeters, 2 choirs, densely but not overly densely written. And that is the kind of book that we actually find in these places. And it was written by professional hands. Some of these books were written by not amateurs, but not professional scribes, probably scriveners who were used to writing letters and such, but not Bibles or religious books. Now, how does such a booklet compare to fragments that must have belonged to a full Siddur? There were Siddurim of a size similar to that of the Haggadah booklets, as the one on the screen, while some were larger and measure about 20 centimeters. So Siddurim tend to be larger. We note that this Siddur is way more densely written than the Haggadah we have just looked at. These observations suggest that we can distinguish between 2 distinct book genres in the Geniza society. Please note, however, that a relatively large group of fragments are inconclusive, most of them. All we can say is that some families in the Geniza communities sought to obtain a small, simple, and affordable booklet with the Haggadah to assist them in the task of conducting the annual Seder. Their layouts are unspectacular. In this respect, they diverge significantly from later standalone Haggadot in manuscript. These booklets are the earliest extant evidence of the existence of a standalone Haggadah. But there is no way to determine how common it was to use them. Lacking such features as the large initials, decoration, and illustration, and oftentimes penned in semi-square scripts, they did not afford the function of a ritual as a ritual object in the sense later Haggadot were able to, which I shall now turn. So, that much about the Geniza, and I was able to find about 20 such books that I am pretty certain that they must have been Haggadot for textual reasons or because they have blank pages and so on. But this is really like, okay, let's do a lot of calculation and try to reconstruct just to understand what type of book this actually must have been. So let's now turn to the manuscripts. The first observation is that out of 1,030 prayer books from the period between 1250 to 1650, only 81 books, slightly less than 8%, are individually bound standalone Haggadot. Not much. No fewer than 651 prayer books, both Siddurim and Machzorim, do include the Haggadah in parallel in the same period. So there's 651 Haggadot in Siddurim versus 81 standalone Haggadot. About 300 come like modern prayer books without the Haggadah. This means that we are dealing with 732 manuscripts that contain the text of the Haggadah in some form but only slightly more than 11% of these were standalone Haggadot. Judging thus from the manuscript evidence during the period under question, the overwhelming majority of Jews approached the Haggadah via the Siddur, or in some regions, such Italy, for example, also the Machzor, rather than as an individually bound book. Very few of those manuscripts can be dated to the late 13th century. In the 14th, the number began to increase slowly, but still only 5 14th century standalone Haggadah survived from the German lands, not much. Thus, throughout the entire 14th century, the main medium for approaching the Haggadah in the German lands was still the Siddur. Moving westwards to Iberia and southern France, and some of you have seen the actually facsimile today of this very lavish manuscript. So moving westward to Iberia and southern France, we witness a somewhat different situation. There we have 17 Haggadot from the 14th century that have survived from areas of the Crown of Aragon and southern France. Among them, we find a group of 7 famous for their well-studied picture cycles of biblical narratives, and that's what you see here on the screen as well. Yet even more important is the observation, and those who have been earlier today remember, more importantly is that actually the majority of these here, again in statistic terms, is actually a Passover Machzor and not a standalone Haggadah. And I'm not sure we can actually define them as a book. That was ritually used during the Seder ritual. The intention behind their production, seems not to lie in the wish to make a handy volume for use during Seder, but to split the general Machzor into smaller units. Most of the richly illustrated Haggadot with biblical cycles belong to this genre. Only 7 books from this early phase can in fact be categorized as standalone Haggadot that were used only at home and only for the Passover Seder. These compendia are a unique Iberian phenomenon, but during the second half of the 14th century, they became sparse, and in the 15th, they disappeared altogether. It is in 15th century Ashkenaz and among Ashkenazi migrants in northern Italy that the figures began to change significantly for the first time. In general, we can see a considerable increase in manuscript production in these communities, as can be learned from this table. And the numbers actually speak for themselves. There are 64 surviving 15th century Ashkenazi and French Siddurim in the corpus. Again, the majority of these 52 come with the Seder liturgy. While the number of standalone Haggadot increased to 19, that is 24%, and some of these were richly illustrated. Thus, Siddurim without the Haggadah were rare in 15th century Ashkenaz and France. Now, the graphs, Ashkenaz and to your left and France on the other side, Ashkenaz and France on one side and Ashkenazim in Italy on the other side, speak again for themselves, very colorful. The following anecdote is significant in this respect, just to wrap this up. A French scribe, one Menachem ben Avraham from Lyon, who compiled a miscellany of various halachic texts, including the Siddur, which is now in Parma, penned the well-known mnemonic rhymes, which you probably all know, or many of you know. They are very common in modern Haggadot. They start like Kadesh Urchatz, Karpas Yachatz Magid, Karpas Yachatz Magid Rachatz, and they are a set of rhymed. These are actually mostly 10, but sometimes more than 10. steps of the ritual acts that you have to perform during Seder. And they're very easy to learn because they're very rhythmic and they're rhymed. So you actually can memorize the Haggadah very easily, memorize the ritual very easily when learning these verses. So he has, this Siddur has these mnemonic rhymes, but that's it. No further Haggadah. And a bit of instructions and explanations. And then he added a somewhat apologetic explanation about why he did not copy the Haggadah. And I quote, "I do not write any part of the Haggadah." So actually people expected to be Haggadah, to include that the Haggadah will be included in the Siddur. So he says, "I did not copy any part of the Haggadah because I do not have the time to write at length." And then he added that the Haggadah is usually included in prayer books. He suffered from the cold weather and noted that he planned to write a more complete prayer book during the summer. A similar note that he had no spare time to elaborate is found at the end of the Siddur. So this scribe obviously thought that he needed to explain why he did not include the Haggadah in his Siddur. The evidence is clear-cut. While some Ashkenazi patrons on both sides of the Alps fancied illustrated Haggadot, and artists demonstrated remarkable creativity in producing them, the vast majority of Jews everywhere still used the general prayer book to study and read the Haggadah, or had no text at all at their disposal. Yet the circle of those who purchased standalone Haggadot was extremely small. Finally, a brief look at how Siddurim diverged from Haggadot in terms of their material features. They differ largely in terms of size, embellishment, and layout, an observation that suggests that they were used in different ways and fulfilled different functions. Let us look at a 13th century example from Italy. This is an Haggadah, relatively large but slim. And you see it's plain. It doesn't have illustrations, but you still see that it's not densely written. It's lightweight, but you had colored initials, again, to find your way around in navigating the manuscript. So Siddurim, and I showed you this yesterday, are different. Semi-cursive, less initials, more text, and so on. These are different books. Illustration is another material feature, typical of many standalone Haggadot, and some of those of you who have been with the facsimile section this earlier today already learned a bit about the nature of these illustrations. So this is again a Haggadah by Joel Ben Simeon, whom I mentioned earlier. This is again one of the early Italian ones, when shortly after he had moved to northern Italy in the middle of the 15th century. And what also is interesting, actually, and what I probably did not mention, that he was very much aware already of print technology, of developing print technology. I mean, this is pre-Gutenberg, a few years earlier, but print was around. I mean, there were woodcuts, and there were single woodcuts, and there were all sorts of printing techniques on textiles and so on. So he actually followed, he observed that kind of development, and the way he actually dealt with his clientele and the number of manuscripts he did actually shows that, and the way he did them, the way he added these drawings actually shows us that he was aware of what is going on. But he remained within the realm of manuscript production and did not go on to print. I mean, printing was needed investment and was not so easy. But there is some feature. There are definitely some features that tell you that he was aware of what is going on and how you actually market your products and how you seek a clientele. Yes. So this is, and I mentioned already that some of these books are of the what I defined earlier, the bookmark type, which just tells you, okay, this is the page with the 4 suns, and we can see this just from the marginal vignettes, even if we not actually look at the text at the moment. And there's more going on during the entire, in the course of the entire manuscript. So this is going on in the 15th century. Now, some people finally, and this is the distinction that we can make between Haggadot and Sidurim. Now, some people finally seem to have manipulated their Sidurim or Machzorim at some point. We don't know when, but that happened. In doing so, they gained a standalone Haggadah by cutting out a Haggadah from a Sidur or a Machzor. So some people were ready to compromise, even though, of course, the product was not exactly what we would expect from a Haggadah, but it was still probably useful and more handy to be used during the ritual. A well-known example of this practice is the 14th century Sephardi Machzor, which is now divided between Bologna and Modena. And this is the Modena part. From the outset, this was an unusual book. In size, layout, and embellishment, it contains a biblical image cycle. It resembles the Passover compendia from the same period, but instead of including only the Haggadah and Piyutim for the Passover week, it is a machzor for all 3 pilgrimage holidays. So it's much thicker. Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. At some later stage, the Haggadah text was separated out. That is the part that is now in Modena. And the rest of it went to Bologna eventually, so it was separated. The fact that the biblical image cycle remained with the Machzor part, now in Bologna, suggests that this separation must have occurred when the illuminated luxury compendium was no longer meaningful to its owners, who simply wanted a separate booklet with the Haggadah. This Haggadah is a very slim book and contains no other prayers or Piyutim. That is the one in Modena. And there are other examples, and they're quite interesting. A 15th century Siddur of Sephardi script displays signs of yet farther reaching manipulations. On folio 119 verso, 2.5 pages into the synagogue service for the eve of Passover. Yeah, so this is here down. The text is interrupted in the middle of the intermediate blessing and continues on the following page in the later and non-professional script. And it's black. It's blacker than the rest of the ink. So there's different ink, different script, non-professional ink, non-professional script. And it kind of continues where this stops. So what happened? And it's only on the bottom of the page here where the original script actually comes back with a section of the Hallel, the second verse of the Hallel before the meal. Hallelujah. It is likely that the choir or 2 with the Haggadah were taken out. The addition continues to the intermediate blessing, which apparently was cut out with the Haggadah. At the end of the Hallel, on folio 123, we read in cursive script, and everybody drinks, and afterwards one says, followed by the last blessing of the Haggadah. Given that the Seder liturgy is now missing from this book, this makes no sense. This actual sentence makes no sense because there is no Haggadah in it. So why would they say so? And actually suggested indeed this book originally contained the Haggadah. So people wanted a standalone Haggadah at some point in history and needed one and sought one and even cut it out from other books. I shall conclude this part of the discussion about the emergence of standalone Haggadot with a few remarks on printed books. In many ways, assessing printed prayer books quantitatively is more difficult than assessing manuscripts. A central problem is that we have very only vague notions about print runs. During the incunable period, there were actually probably only a few hundred copies printed, a bit more of liturgical books, less than other books. The print runs for other books were smaller. So we don't know really how many copies of each book were sold or were existent at all. The first printed Haggadah, a small, undecorated, and unvocalized booklet, was published in circa 1482 in Guadalajara by Shlomo Alcabez. And it really belongs to the very early printing phase of incunable printing in Hebrew. It had been suggested that it was actually part of a larger compilation of liturgical texts. Given that the Haggadah is printed very densely in just a few pages, this assumption makes sense. Now, the fact that two texts are now kept separately suggests, however, that they were meant to be offered to clients either as parts of a larger volume or as separate units, some sort of off-print of like a separatum. It appears that this would become a rather widespread norm among early printers, and we encountered this phenomenon until deep into the 16th century. This in turn indicates that early printers were not certain about the marketing prospects of printed Haggadot. And this is an important point because we have very few printed Haggadot, and especially very few illustrated print relatively speaking, and it's in the begin only in the 1520s. So there seems to be some hesitation about whether this is actually worth doing. Probably the investment is too enormous, and the whole project might fail. So early printers, we consider, and this is also what actually Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi hinted at, were not eager to print the Haggadah. They were not certain how it would sell. And selling was important for early printers because otherwise the whole shop would actually fall into pieces. Illustrated Haggadot were not printed before 1500. The earliest example, barely known actually, extant only again in fragments from the Cairo Geniza, is a Haggadah printed by the brothers Ibn Nachmias in Istanbul between 1505 and 1510 for the community of Sephardi refugees in the workshop in Istanbul, in the Nachmias workshop in Istanbul. Now, I shall discuss this Haggadah in detail in the workshop at the JTS in a few days, but a few words I would say already now. There are about 40 fragments, and one can actually distinguish between three different editions. So this was a need. They printed it within a few years 3 times, and we know there was supposed. Somebody suggested, Adri Offenberg, in fact, suggested that the Ibn Nachmias brothers first landed in Naples together with Isaac Abarbanel. And there they commissioned a set of woodcuts in a Christian workshop of a rather famous humanist by the name of Francesco del Tupo, who had his most famous work is an edition of the Aesop Life and Fables from 1485. And the style is really very similar. I mean, there can be not much doubt that this attribution is correct. So they commissioned a set of woodcuts, and then the plague breaks out in Naples, and they go off to Istanbul with the woodcuts, with the wood themselves. And then it takes a while to print the Haggadah. Why? Because there was the the war with Venice, and there was no paper imported into Istanbul, and then they started out much later in 1505 to actually print whatever the Ibn Nachmias printed in Istanbul, and then they printed this Haggadah, and it has 5 such images of plagues, and this is a ritual one. I'm going to talk a bit about this in the workshop at the JTS. I'm currently busy myself in reconstructing this whole thing because it's all pieces. The smallest fragment is at the size of my thumbnail. About some are double pages, I'm in full folio, but most of them are not. So this is kind of a jigsaw puzzle that I and an assistant of mine are busy ourselves with. But this is actually the first illustrated Haggadah. It's less known because it's all pieces, but it's out there, and it's an interesting, very interesting example. In 1526, the first Ashkenazi Haggadah with illustrations was printed in Prague. So this is like 70 years after the first printing machine was introduced. 1526. It was printed in Prague by Gershom ben Solomon HaKohen. One of HaKohen's collaborators in Prague was Chaim Shechor, who left Prague soon after the completion of the Prague Haggadah. We find him in Augsburg from the early 1530s, where he published, among others, an illustrated Haggadah, and that's the one you see here. And well, this is a bit exaggerating, but this is the size, approximately the size of the Prague Haggadah, and this is the size of the Augsburg Haggadah. So again, these are different books. And it's possible even that Shechor cut the images in the Prague Haggadah. That was suggested, it's not certain, but he was involved in that project. He knew the Prague Haggadah, but he decided to print a different book. And also interesting is that Shechor in Augsburg put into his book the short version of Shfoch Hamatcha, pour out your wrath. And those of you who were early in the afternoon heard that there were different, that Ashkenazim had the long version of these cursed psalms, and the Italians had only 1 or 2. So what we actually can figure out is that this Chaim Shechor catered to different clienteles, both German and Italian, because he was concerned that he might not actually sell this Haggadah. The very lavish and beautiful Prague Haggadah was printed only once. There were later editions that were of a poorer quality, but this one was printed only once. And one wonders actually if it was a commercial success. It's not clear. So again, printers were cautious about putting that much money into these endeavors. Gershom Cohen's 1526 Prague Haggadah was a very bold and pioneering undertaking. Carefully laid out, richly illustrated on almost every page, and decorated with frames and some initial panels with its almost 30 centimeter height, it was also the largest Haggadah project thus far. So this is kind of a station here. Still handy and not heavy, its large square types are of the highest quality and vocalized. Handsome illustrations guided the Seder leader in staging the ritual. It was a very handsome equivalent of the 15th century manuscript Haggadah of the sort that Yoel ben Shimon had produced. And it is likely still considered a rather luxurious object for the wealthy. The Augsburg edition, on the other hand, demonstrate that there must have been a demand also for somewhat more modest books. A significantly smaller volume, measuring only 20 centimeters, and less richly, albeit very handsomely illustrated, it likely was intended for different kinds of users. It has only every few pages one image. They're very good. They were professionally cut, but less definitely less. The Prague Haggadah also has on the margin on some of the pages we see that has bits and pieces of a commentary. This is missing in the Augsburg Haggadah. So definitely a way simpler book than the Prague Haggadah, and probably also cheaper to produce and cheaper to be sold. Now, some more editions followed throughout the 16th century in the Ashkenazi world, but at a surprisingly slow pace. In 1556, Gershom HaKohen's sons issued a small-sized edition of the Prague Haggadah with short commentaries in Hebrew and translations in Yiddish. Its illustration program incorporated various previously used woodcuts, including some from the 1526 edition. All in all, a cheap and small version of the original 1526 edition. Some of the woodcuts were worn out. It was smaller. It was less beautifully laid out. It was definitely and I think even on the screen you can see that this is a less lavish, a less spectacular book. Altogether, the years 1590, 1606, 1610, 1624, and 1644 saw more Ashkenazi editions. So now there's more of this stuff. They were printed in Prague, Lublin, and Krakow. And we know the clear rise around the turn of the century. Apparently a byproduct of an increasing demand for printed Haggadot for Ashkenazi clienteles north of the Alps. Lublin, Krakow, Prague. Compared to the manuscript evidence, these figures look overwhelming, but they become relevant only in relation to the pace of printing other prayer books. During the first half of the 16th century, while 3 editions of standalone Haggadot were printed in Ashkenazi areas, there were 8 editions of the Seder with the Haggadah and only 1 without the Passover liturgy. So the ratio is almost the same. And between the 15th and the 16th century, actually, there's not much different. And this kind of trend continued also into the second half of the 16th century. Now, when we turn to Italy, the situation is a bit different. So this is Prague again, 1505. So what happens in Italy? In Italy, the developments are particularly interesting. Italy is really the center of Jewish printing. It's mostly done in the early Cuneiform period. There were Jewish printers, especially the Soncino family. Later, it was Christian workshops who printed these books, but they employed Jewish editors and Jewish proofreaders and so on. So what's going on here? Because of the Ashkenazi migration during the 15th century, northern Italy actually turns into yet another center of Ashkenazi book culture. And here in 1486, in Soncino, the town that his family, which originated from Franconia, had chosen as its surname eventually, Joshua Shlomo Soncino issued a small-sized Roman Rite Siddur, known as Sidorello. It has survived in 2 copies, one in London and one in New York. And he actually says here in his colophon, which is here, and here you have a translation of the colophon. Here, the holy work of the Tfilat Yechid, as it is common among our people from the Holy Community of Rome, is completed. So this is completed on this page. It follows the order as it commonly appears in the work known as Judeo-Italian as Sidorello. These prayers were arranged by a person who is used to and knows the correct and right order. Their writing was properly supervised and so on. So he gives a date. So this is apparently, one would believe, this is the end of the book. But then there is the next page, and this is the Haggadah, and this is the end of the book. So here we have again one of those off-print separata type of books. They were not sure, would they actually be able to sell and standalone Haggadah? So we can actually go for two options, Haggadah with Siddur, and if somebody wants a standalone, he can buy a standalone Haggadot. Now, this is actually possible because we know that both in Jewish societies and Christian societies, books were sold unbound. That's how people bought printed books, unbound volumes. Sometimes even there was a subscription system of single quires they would sell, and then the printers would go on printing, and then they would sell the next quire and so on. And then the owners went and had the books bound, so they can bind them together or separate. So again, like in Guadalajara, we have here this off-print method of using the Haggadot. So this is the JTS copy, and here the Haggadah follows immediately this colophon that says this is the end of the book. So it is not the end of the book, obviously. So there's this modular and flexible marketing strategy that we already observed in Guadalajara. So indeed, Italian printers seem to have been hesitant about publishing Haggadot. It would take until 1557 that Venturino Ruffinelli published a small-sized, very plain, unillustrated Roman Rite Haggadah. I don't have a picture because it was never published. I only have a screenshot from a microfilm, which I, for aesthetic reasons, don't share with us. So this is all there was. And it came out in two editions, a Roman Rite and an Ashkenazi Rite, small, plain, poor, and so on. But remember it, I'll come back to it in a moment. And one of these editions actually is also of this separata type. So the illustrated Haggadah was a different matter altogether. In 1560, again, Ruffinelli's son Giacomo, so that was the same workshop that 3 years earlier printed the plain Haggadah. They printed the famous Mantua Haggadah, 1560. It was designed as a block book. Why as a block book? Block books were things that was a technique that was used before Gutenberg to print actually pages. The text was cut in wood, and like a woodcut was printed on the page, and sometimes with illustration. So why in 1560 they would actually return to a woodcut? It was suggested that they actually wanted an equivalent of the Prague Haggadah, and it has the same text portions indeed as every page has the same text portion like the Prague Haggadah. So they wanted their own Prague Haggadah, but that is a suggestion that there were no fonts, there were no types of Ashkenazi fonts available in Mantua. So they had to print a block book, which is very strange. But they didn't like the images in the Prague Haggadah. They were too crudish, north of the Alps. So they had a full set of new woodcuts in Italian style, Italian Renaissance style. And this is very delicate. So they kind of Italianized the Ashkenazi Prague Haggadah, but in every other respect, this was actually the same book, exactly the same book. It was a purely Ashkenazi book. And the larger part of the Jewish population of Mantua, indeed, was Ashkenazi. It was a mixed population, but many of these people were Ashkenazim. So this is 1560 in Mantua. So as the Prague Haggadah, it must have been a costly and thus risky endeavor, way more expensive than the plain 1557 editions, and certainly designed for a different clientele. A crucial step toward the emergence of the Haggadah as a more common household item was taken in 1568, only 8 years later, when a so-called second edition of the Mantua Haggadah appeared. It was printed in the shop of the brothers Filotarsi and Calidono Filipponi. And it's actually not really a second edition of that same book. I mean, it looks pretty much the same, but it's different. First of all, it's of inferior artistic quality. The woodcuts were reprinted, they were a bit worn out. These frames are just put together, cut off and put randomly somewhere where there was space. So this is not a lavish book. I mean, it's an illustrated book, and it tries to imitate the Mantua Haggadah. It's also an Ashkenazi book, but not only. And it's of poorer quality. It's also smaller. But at the beginning, it has a sheet with instructions. It has a title page, and it has this sheet here. And this sheet is bilingual. So we have seen that so far, apart from one of the editions of the 57 Haggadah, everything was Ashkenazi. There's no Sephardi once after the Istanbul Haggadah, and there were no Italians except one plain Haggadah. So this one now is, as the reddish marker says, addressed le Ashkenazim beluazim benasheem. And then somebody asked yesterday a question, and I mentioned this already. So this is going to two clienteles. They cater to both communities. And then they have these instructions, and there's Italian and Yiddish here. So this was obviously something that was supposed to broaden the circle of potential clients. People are still concerned that they might not sell the Haggadah, actually. And it also has a commentary. And this becomes now actually a kind of a norm that in the second half of the 16th century, most of these printed Haggadah came with a commentary. But these are commentaries most often relatively simple. They were not scholarly. They were plain explanations, sometimes really offering some ideas of how you actually can still enrich what is going on during the Seder. The next step, and yet another major breakthrough, is also less known actually as the most famous ones that we usually read about in books. And this was around the turn of the century. There we have 4 editions within 6 years, 1599 to 1605. 4 editions were printed in Venice with the same concept as the second Mantua editions, addressing different clientele. Artistically, they are a mess. They really put bits and pieces together. Here a woodcut they had, and another woodcut, and they were reused, and they were very worn out. Not very fancy, but now they have actually this initial instructions sheet, and that is not only in Yiddish and Italian, but it's also in Castilian. It's also Sephardi. So they want to reach more people. And all of a sudden, they do 4 editions within 6 years. So this is a real change, because they were so hesitant, these printers were so hesitant to print these books, and then all of a sudden they do one after the other in 6 years. And at the moment, I shall come back to this observation. But before I do so, the next major breakthrough came in 1609. And some of you have seen before later copies of this. And in 1609, the way more famous Venice Haggadah was printed for the first time. And it was reprinted in 1629, and then again and again. And many of you are certainly familiar with this project. Not only did the book feature a completely new design with a new set of illustration, completely newly cut, everything new. The frames are for every page. So this is carefully laid out, careful composition with decoration and imagery, some of it biblical, some of it ritual, and so on. But there were 3 editions. There were not one edition with a sheet in 3 languages, but there were 3 editions, one Ashkenazi, one Sephardi, and one of the Roman, right, with instructions in Yiddish, Italian, and Ladino. Larger and more lavish than the editions printed at the turn of the century, these books must have attracted an upper middle class and a different clientele than the way poorer examples from 1599 and so on. So this was a new book. This was a new concept. Now, my last point made today actually brings us to this very period. And I would like to approach the emergence of this book genre from a different angle. And that is my last point today. Attempts to reconstruct Jewish book collections are based on inventories of Jewish households and on other kinds of book lists that were compiled for a variety of reasons. The earliest such lists were found in the Cairo Geniza. Later examples appear in different contexts throughout the Middle Ages. The households where the listed books were found were most likely learned and wealthy, thus among the elites. There is, however, one kind of evidence that offers a more complete picture of what sorts of books were found in the homes of one particular Jewish community in Italy. One of the byproducts of the Catholic Counter-Reformation was the censure of Jewish books in the aftermath of the burnings of the Talmud in Italian cities in 1553. On August 27, 1595, Francesco Gonzaga, the Bishop of Mantua, appointed 3 censors to examine Jewish books for forbidden content, that is, content considered to be heretic, blasphemic, harmful, erroneous to Christianity. The committee included Domenico Ierushalmi, one of the most prominent censors who worked, and he signed numerous Hebrew manuscripts and printed books during those years. Now, the members of the Jewish community were instructed to bring their books to the Inquisition and to pay a certain sum to cover the censors' salaries. During the weeks that followed, the community and the committee negotiated a procedure, and it was decided that each household that owned any given amount of books compile a list of titles in their possession. So this is really a tragic growth for book history. By February 1596, some 452 book lists were delivered to the Inquisition. As Shlomo Simonson suggested, this number might also have included lists from households outside the city in the entire province of Mantua. A second set of some 493 lists was delivered in March 1605, after Domenico Ierushalmi had spent another term in Mantua from 1599 to 1605. Whereas the 1596 lists were written in Hebrew letters, and here you have an example, those from 1605 appear in Latin script. So here we have an example from the later set. Both sets of lists can be found in the archives of the Jewish community of Mantua. We also know that around that time, the province of Mantua counted about 580 Jewish households. What is significant in these lists that they offer us a complete picture of the book holdings in an entire community and not only the inventories of a handful of scholars. Let us take a brief look at these lists and then see how the standalone Haggadah fares in them. The 1596 lists were submitted 3 years before the trilingual Haggadah editions began to be published in Venice. So that was the one with the sheet in front of the book with the 3 different languages. The lists of 1605 were compiled while sales of these editions must have been intense. For various reasons, not all the 452 lists can be considered. Some of them belong to synagogues, to bookstores, and to others. But most of them, about 430, belong to private households. Hence, there was a significant group of people who did not own books. Out of 580, 427 delivered lists. The rest did not have any book in their homes. Of these 429 collections, only 109 contained an intact Haggadah, about 25% altogether, and that was in 1596. That means that less than 20% of all the families in the entire Mantuan region owned a Haggadah. By and large, this confirms the observations I offered above about the developments between the late 16th century, before the publication of the Venice editions. In addition to these 109 households, we find 4 more that reported ownership only of Haggadah that were torn or worn out, but apparently not replaced by any new ones. Some of these worn out Haggadot are described as manuscripts. And they were very organized lists. They would say the title, and then like a good bibliographical list, they would say the place and the printing year. And then they would say, if there was no printing year, this is the Ktaviat, this is the manuscript. So the evidence is very interesting here. The small, unillustrated, and apparently rather cheap editions of 1557 were in fact the most frequently listed Haggadot. And that, even though there were 2 illustrated editions printed in Mantua in the same city, but still the plain one was the more popular. Very few households mention that they have more than one Haggadah, usually 2 or 4, but this is very rare. Only the really big, rich collections have more than one Haggadah. So this is an interesting evidence. But if we now look at the next set, 9 years later, only 9 years later, and these were now delivered in Italian, as I said, and we actually see some significant developments. First of all, we learn from these lists that the 4 multilingual editions from 1599 to 1605 must have been overwhelmingly successful. Lots of people now all of a sudden owned these Haggadot. So not only were they printed within 6 years in 4 editions, there was also a clientele that actually wanted to buy these books. Now, a total of 186 lists, nearly 40% mentioned at least one Haggadah. So this is a huge increase in only 9 years. So some 32% of all the approximate households in the province of Mantua. 84 of the Haggadah owners, that is nearly half of them, listed 1 or 2 of the Venice edition. So all of a sudden, they also buy more than 1. So more members of the family during the ritual actually would use the Haggadah. So this is a very sharp change, actually. And I would say that actually it is only now that we can say that the Haggadah now begins to become a common household item. So to wrap this up, the foregoing discussion suggests that the Haggadah did not emerge in a uniform linear movement. Rather, there were 4 distinct developments in the emergence of the Haggadah, and there is good reason to believe that these were in fact largely independent one from another. The Geniza booklets, consisting of 1 or 2 quires, the use of such booklets might go back to the 11th or 10th or 12th centuries. In 14th century Iberia, we have the luxurious, predominantly Catalan, very richly illuminated Passover compendia, and they must have been produced for a very wealthy elite. From the 1440s, illustrated Haggadot of a distinctly different kind began to be produced for Ashkenazi clienteles. And then although printed Haggadot began to appear in the Sephardi world earliest in the 15th century, it was only in the Ashkenazi world from the late 1560s on that printed Haggadah gradually developed into a widespread medium that actually circulated also in Sephardi and Italian communities. But I should add that actually these endeavors were Ashkenazim, did they? The editors were Ashkenazi, and they reached out to other clientele. So this was really an Ashkenazi endeavor. It is only toward the middle of the 17th century that the individually bound, frequently but not always illustrated Haggadah began to turn into a common household object. So that's covering about 400 years of history. Actually, the history is quite diverse. So in the next session, I'm going to talk about ritual guide and more illustration than thus far. So thank you very much.
Okay.